This lesson is going to review the quadratic formula and how it is used to solve quadratic equations on the ACT college entrance exam. Let's head over to the classroom for some instruction. Okay, let's talk about the quadratic formula. What's it used for? It's used to solve any kind of quadratic equation, especially the ones that are set equal to 0. And when you're using this quadratic formula, you have to make sure the equation is set equal to 0. Let's talk about what we're dealing with first so we know what numbers are going where. You're going to be dealing with a quadratic trinomial, such as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You have to understand what's a, what's b, what's c. A will be the leading coefficient. That's the number that goes with the x squared. B will always be the coefficient, the number in front of the x, and c will always be the constant, the number that doesn't have an x. Now the quadratic formula, you may or may not need, they might give it to you on the ACT, but I highly doubt it. This is one that's commonly used and you should know it. So here we go, here's the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. This whole thing is divided by 2a. Okay, so let's take a look at some quadratic equations and how it's used to solve it. First example. X squared minus 14x plus 45 equals 0. Go ahead and write x equals. Now we have to understand, by looking at, understand what a, b, and c is. A is 1 in this case, b is negative 14, c is 45. So all we have to do is what I call plug and chug. Plug the numbers in, do the math. Here we go. Negative b. So we know b is negative 14. Negative b just means the opposite of that number. So you're going to have 14 plus or minus. Then you're going to have to take that same number and square it. It says b squared. So even if it's a negative 14 times negative 14 is a positive number. So just worry about squaring the 14, which, if you remember your perfect squares, 14 squared is 196. So I go ahead and do that. Then you're going to have minus 4 times what a is. A is 1 in this case. And then you got c, which is 45. All over 2 times 1. Okay, so now we got to do a little bit of math. We got to do what's inside the square root. That needs cleaned up a little bit. Got to do our math. So we're going to have 14 plus or minus 196. Now here's what I do. I take a look at these numbers, and this is where a lot of students will mess up. How many negatives do you see? I only see one negative, so I know that we're going to have a minus. We're going to be subtracting some number from 196. If you would have 2 negatives, you would be putting a plus there. You would be adding a number to 196. If you would have had all 3 negatives there, you know that 3 negatives, that's an odd number of negatives. So when you multiply that's a negative, you would have a minus situation there. That's where people make mistakes, is this simple sign right here. So that's why I'm making a big deal of it. So we're going to have to multiply. We got 1 negative, so I know it's going to be a minus. Let's go ahead and get that figured out and out of the way. Now all we have to do is multiply 4 and 1, that's 4. Then we got to take 4 times 45, which is 180. And don't worry if you can't do it in your head. You got your calculator, don't worry. You got your best friend with you. Okay, and that's all over 2 times 1 or 2. So now we have to still do the subtraction part in the radical. That's the next step. So you got 14 plus or minus. Then you have the square root of, well, take 196 minus 180. That's, what, 16? All over 2. Then you're going to notice, well, 16, that's a nice number. We like that number. That's square root of that, it's 4, so it's going to turn into now 14 plus or minus 4 over 2. Okay, now we can go further. We're going to find out that it has 2 solutions, 2 zeros, 2 roots, which a lot of times it's commonly called. So what this means is you have x is equal to, you can take 14 plus 4 and divide it by 2, or 14 minus 4. and divided by 2. 14 plus 4, that's 18 divided by 2, so we're going to get 18 divided by 2 is 9. The other one, 14 minus 4, that's 10. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Now, I'm going to show you something. You kind of might get upset with me, but I need to show you something. Let's take that same thing. Remember when we talked about factoring? That quadratic, I believe, factors. Let's try and solve it by factoring. Well, you would have x's in the fronts. Last term's positive. That means the signs are the same. So they're going to be the same as the middle. So we're going to have minus, minus. And then what times what is 45, but adds to 14? That's 9 and 5. And then if you solve each one, you would get x equals 9 and x equals 5. And you're probably saying, wow, that is so much faster. Well, why do we need to learn all this? That seems a lot of easy. We can make mistakes easily. Well, not all quadratics are factorable, one. Not all quadratics have rational roots. They're irrational, like square roots of 5 or something like that. And not all quadratics have solutions that are real. Sometimes they have complex roots, and we're going to look at a couple examples of those situations. So it is a good idea to know the quadratic formula. So it'll solve any kind of quadratic that we could be given, any kind of quadratic equation you have to face on the ACT. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, let's take a look at a situation where that's not factorable and also that's not set equal to 0. We have to make sure when we use the quadratic formula, you have to have that quadratic set equal to 0, such as x squared minus 3x equals 5. It's not equal to 0, you got to make it equal to 0. So you're going to subtract 5 from both sides, and you're going to get x squared minus 3x minus 5 equals 0. Now it's set equal to 0. Now we get ready to use the quadratic formula. Negative b, that's negative of negative 3, so that's positive 3. Plus or minus, now we're going to take that 3 and square it. That's going to be 3 squared, it's 9. Minus, then 4 times, leading coefficient's 1, times negative 5. All over 2 times 1. Okay, now we got to clean up the inside of that square root. So we're going to leave that 3 out here alone. Plus or minus. You're going to have 9 still there. And now you got to think, are we going to add or subtract a number? Well, let's take a look. You got 2 negatives. That means a positive. So we're going to be adding something to it. Now all you got to do is multiply 4 times 1. That's 4. Times 5, you get 20. And then 2 times 1 on the bottom is 2. Clean it up one more time. You're going to have 3 plus or minus the square root of 29 over 2. And you'll notice that 29 is inside the square root is not one of those perfect squares. So we cannot break it down any further. This is your final answer. You would have 2 answers, 3 plus the square root of 29 over 2 and 3 minus the square root of 29 over 2. When you get something like this is referred to as an irrational number. That means the quadratic is not factorable. So that's why the quadratic equation, that formula, really helps you do any situation that's possible. Now let's take a look at one more, because sometimes you end up with a negative inside this square root. And that means you have a complex root, complex zeros. We like to call it imaginary numbers. So let's take a look at an example of that. X squared minus 2x plus 6 equals 0. Okay, that one already has it set equals 0, so we have no problem. Well, let's go ahead and start plugging the numbers in. X equals, we're going to have the opposite of negative 2, so that's going to be 2 plus or minus. Square that 2, that will be 4. Minus 4 times, leading coefficient is 1. And then we have 6 for the c. All over 2 times 1. All right, let's clean up the inside of that radical. We have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 4. Now it's going to be a minus because you only have one negative here, so it's going to be a minus. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 6 is 24. over 2. Now we got to do the subtraction inside the square root. You're going to have 2 plus or minus. The square root of 4 minus 24 is negative 20 all over 2. Now if you notice, you have a negative number in the square root, and that means that you don't have a real answer. You have an imaginary. You have a complex root, a complex 0. So here's how you have to handle that. First of all, that negative means if you had square root of a negative 1, that means I. So when I see that, I know we're going to write 2 plus or minus I. And now we got to deal with that radical 20. When we talked about simplifying radicals in one of the lessons that you'll see, we can take that 20 and we can write it as 4 times 5. Square root of 4 is 2. I'm going to put that 2 here. We can't square root 5, so we're going to leave it inside. That's in that simplifying the radical section. All over 2. Now we're going to go one more step. We're going to take each one of these terms over 2. So it's going to look like this. 2 over 2 plus or minus. You can write it like that. And then you're going to have 2i radical 5 or square root of 5 all over 2. So basically you're taking each one of these terms divided by 2. That simplifies. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so you're going to get 1 plus or minus. These 2's would cancel, leaving you with I radical 5. This is a situation where you couldn't even factor it, so quadratic formula, again, takes care of any kind of situation you have dealing with quadratic equations.